Good morning, Facebook friends. Helen Archontou here, CEO of the YWCA of Northern New Jersey. So happy to have some time with you on this Tuesday. We are together at YWTV, which is a wonderful opportunity for us to be engaged and inspired and educated. And today is no different. We've got another wonderful conversation for you, and on an important day for women. So this conversation is part of our Why Women Vote series. As we know, this is a big election year. Every year is a big election year, but this year we also have a presidential election on top of many other key elections in front of us. And there are also many important policy decisions that are a priority. So who we put in office is very important. Voting is an American principle. It's a basic democratic right, and it should be protected, promoted, and practiced. And the YWCA of Northern New Jersey has focused a good part of our YWTV conversations over these last few months on important issues that women should be thinking about when they are in the ballot, if putting their ballot in November. And our national organization, YWCA USA, did a wonderful report where they surveyed women across the country about what issues are important to them. We'll put the link for that report here in the comments for you. But we have highlighted so many of those, and we'll continue to highlight the key issues for women through that report. That said, today is a big anniversary. It is the anniversary of the 19th Amendment of the right to vote for women. It's a great opportunity to also share some important news about voting in New Jersey and across the country. Governor Phil Murphy announced that New Jersey voters, for the very first time, will predominantly be using mail-in ballots to ensure safety during this coronavirus pandemic. Ballots will be mailed the first week of October. And all schools and sites for polling locations will actually be closed for in-person classes during that time. And that way, anyone who does go in, it limits activity. But you also have the ability to mail in your ballots. And we encourage you, however you vote, to make sure that you do it. Today, we're going to do a little walk down memory lane and talk about how women got the right to vote. And in addition, we're going to talk a little bit about when all women got the right to vote, because there's some wonderful teachings here, and everyone may not know the history, but we are so grateful to have a wonderful historian with us today. And we have Dr. Christiane Warren with us. She is the Senior Education Consultant at Anna J. Cooper Education Advocacy Consultants. She is joining us this morning to look at the struggles and the challenges that took decades in order to get women the right to vote. So before we jump into this important conversation, I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Warren. She is recognized for producing growth and cultivating success in the career and education space. She has served as tenured faculty, department chair, and the academic dean for the entire division and academic affairs office. She worked with 2- and 4-year institutions in private and public institutions, both in New York and New Jersey. She's dedicated her work to promoting education and equity and social justice and academic excellence and opportunity. Her portfolio includes including social science focused revisions in criminal justice and human service degree programs, institution college-wide policy revisions and practices that have reduced dropout rates, increased graduation, and improved alumni giving at her client institutions. Her clients regularly get placed at the universities of their choice, along with rewarding financial aid packages. She is highly sought out for conference panelists and event organizers. She is an award-winning educator and a published author to merge community activism with higher education enrollment and programming reform. We are so happy to have you here, Dr. Warren. Welcome.
Thank you, Helen, for this wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for having me. And please call me Christiane.
Happy to, Christiane.
Yes.
Happy. So it's a big day for
Yes.
women today. It's a very big day. So tell us a little bit in case someone doesn't know what's the significance of this day.
Well, today is when finally the last state ratified the 19th Amendment, which is also the so called suffrage amendment. And that gave all American women the right to vote, technically or theoretically, although in essence or in reality at the time, due to Jim Crow laws, in particular the American South, a lot of African American women, as well as some Latino and Native American and Asian women, for various different reasons, were exempted or effectively barred in the early decades of the 20th, and along with men of the different ethnic backgrounds. So and only during the 1960s, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, where all these various statewide hindrances or sabotage of the constitutional right to vote eliminated. However, it's not quite accurate to say that Black women didn't get the right to vote until 1965, because there were some women. It's just some did not and some did, and it was really mostly in southern states due to race discrimination, alongside with other groups.
So many of us are familiar with these, great historic photos of the suffragettes
Yes.
with the sashes and the hats and the
Yeah.
rustled skirts. So tell us a little bit. I know, I've had the opportunity to, learn so much about the history of that time. Can you share with us a little bit about what it was like to do advocacy at that time and how how they were able to create a movement, even though they didn't have, cars, how they were able to create a movement and,
Yeah.
get us to that point?
Certainly. Well, really, the women's movement, the suffrage movement, let's call it the suffrage movement, because that's what led to the 19th century, 19th Amendment, really has its origin in the early 19th century of reform movements. And it started out with various reform movements who were primarily driven by women. Women who worked in through church affiliation associations, and who focused on various reform efforts such as education, prison reform. Temperance was a huge issue. As we see, we have the Prohibition Amendment around the same time as the voting for women. And then, of course, anti-slavery movement. And that became more and more intertwined with women's efforts in the 1830s and 1840s. And I think really the catalyst for it was that the women decided that they really needed to have their own movement alongside, but somewhat separate from the abolition movement, was 1840, when male and female delegations went to London, England, to a huge international anti-slavery organization conference, and women were not seated as delegates. They could only be in the gallery. They could not vote. And since women are in many ways the grassroots and the strivers and the advocates for these efforts, they felt like, this is not right. So together with lots of men, both Black and white, from various different religious backgrounds, the anti-slavery movement as well as the suffrage movement was always a collaborative effort. And then we always think, everything started in Seneca Falls in 1848. Actually, that's kind of like writing history backwards, giving more importance to an event that at the time was not that important. It was not that widely known, part due to travel, but part to different issues. It was more or less a state or regional conference, not an international or nationwide conference, and not that many people came. But that's I think the reason why we always think everything started there is because of the declaration that was passed, which is kind of similar to the Declaration of Independence, and also the book that Susan B. Anthony, who wasn't even there, wrote several decades later about the definitive, so to say, definitive history of the suffrage movement. And whoever writes history gets to tell his or her version. Not
Right.
saying it's not true, but we all have different emphasis that we place. And so when she voted, she obviously presented, her efforts and that of people like-minded to her as key and central. And I mean, that's human nature. So, but you can't just imagine that people come together to a meeting and boom, the entire movement starts. It was gradual and it continued. The collaboration continued until the Civil War. I mean, right here in New Jersey, we had some of the key women's rights activists that live here in Bergen County, as well as in Hudson County, the Grimke sisters, who initially were from the South and family from owned slaves, and they resisted all that, became very active, both Angina and Sarah, in anti-slavery and in the women's movement. We had many Black women, such as the Fortons in Philadelphia, Sojourner Truth, of course, who was active and wrote and spoke on behalf of both women's rights and anti-slavery. So these are connected efforts. And to get to your point in terms of the suffragettes that we know from the movies or in the early 20th century, some of those tactics were picked up from the British suffragettes. And by that time, we already had a lot more momentum. And it took really, it took, I would say, 70 years or more to get to the passage of the amendment. So what we can't always traditionally know as the suffragettes was really towards the last decade and a half, moving up to the passage. And I think in part, as bad as this may sound, World War I helped in some ways. Unfortunately, often wars also lead, as horrible as wars are, but if we look at history, every time there's a war, we see some movement and breaking of old established traditions, for good or bad. And often then creates opportunities for groups that may not have had opportunities. I mean, you see the Civil War, you see both the First and Second World War, you see that. So, and to say, how did they do it? I mean, they were smart. There was a lot of networking and knowing each other and writing. If you look into the archives, the documents and the conversations, and another thing we have to remember, in the 19th century, since there was no radio, no television, no internet, no smartphones, the only kind of entertainment people had would go to talks or theaters or shows. So people came. There was this huge lecture circuit. People came and somebody gave a talk about all kinds of interesting topics, including, women's rights or civil rights or anti-slavery. And people still read a whole lot more newspapers and magazines and journals. And so people published and spoke and petitioned. See, women always had the right to petition Congress. Even before people had the right to vote, anybody can reach out to their representative. We still have that right today. Anytime you have an issue, contact your representative. Everybody should know who their representative and senator is, both state and Congress. And they do help. They help.
Right.
So that's what people did.
Good reminder. They work for us, for sure.
They work for us, yes.
Yeah.
That's their job.
So it's so interesting. You're talking about the networking they did, the letter writing that they did, the meetings, that they had from planning. It strikes me that it's not so different. Obviously, the technology is different, for sure. But it strikes me that the true, successful techniques and tactics, to make change are not so different today.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And a lot of it is, connecting with people and formulating arguments. And that's what people did. And there was a lot of conversation. And I think sometimes we have a little bit of a skewed understanding because for whatever reason, one speech or one book or one statement kind of survives above the fray. But I don't know. I mean, if you are an active writer and you write over the score of your whole life, to be identified by one piece or one statement, and that completely defines who a person is or who he or she, what he or she stood for. I think that's kind of like limiting, and not necessarily representative, because just think about everybody. If there are probably things we all have said or written at one point or another that maybe now we would not necessarily endorse or may even feel bad about. How would we feel if we, if that's it, that defines us, right? So, but a lot of organization was really done through church groups, through nonprofit, what we call nonprofit groups, charity groups. And we also have to remember that in the 19th century, we did not have any kind of social services or anything like that. And as flawed as our system may be, there are some basic systems. We don't even have universal public education. So people had to kind of provide all of this for themselves, through neighborhood organizations, church auxiliaries, groups like the Masons, Eastern Star, and different type of, or they just formed organization for one cause or another, whatever that cost may be. And so then and then sometimes also due to lack of communication and ability, sometimes people in different locations more or less said the same thing but didn't know about each other until later, and then travel was hard, so things went a little slower. I think we need to understand what life was like in the 19th and early 20th century, and we also want to remember we always right nowadays focus on issues of race, and that's certainly one very important, but we also have to consider class and divisions of class and how much that determines, or class, or let's say income slash education, which kind of are defined definitions for class, how much that defines what you can and cannot do, how you think, how you see the world, depending on where you're from and what your daily life is like. Because most of us, if we advocate for something, it's because for whatever reason, we experienced or saw somebody experience an injustice and we want to change. And most of it somehow relate to it ourselves in one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
So if your issue is that you don't get paid as much as the next person, then that might be what you advocate. If your issue is just, getting basic housing, then that might be what you educate. So I think that's important to consider.
Well, that's it's so interesting to hear the details around it for sure. We touched on, and you started sharing a little bit about when white women versus Black women and the right to vote, and kind of the nuance in there, right? There's there is a distinction which you shared for us on that, which was wonderful. And it's interesting to hear again about how the techniques back then versus the techniques now for organizing are so similar. Can you talk about the relationship between Black women and white women, then and what you see now, and how we have worked together, to be aligned, and to move forward on key issues like this one and others.
Yeah.
And also maybe the converse is, how have we not worked together where we should have? Because I think that, we know both have happened, right?
Yes. So there is obviously collaboration, especially early on with the abolitionist movement, but there's also a split or divergence. And it's really unfortunate because a lot of the suffrage movement leaders were predominantly white middle class women, not exclusively, but a lot of them, especially in the beginning, in part because they had the time and the resources. So it's by default. And this, although there was a very strong Black middle class, but it was relatively small in comparison. Okay, and so the quandary for Black women was often that they basically had to choose a side, which is impossible to choose. So should they go with women's rights or black rights, in either way, in the abolitionist and later black civil rights movement, predominantly leader were black men. And so basically black women have to ask, what is my major issue? Is it being black or is it being a woman? And that is really an unfair question. Why should you choose?
Right.
And it's really hard to do, because on one day the challenge is more because of the color of your skin. The next day it might be because you're a female and there's a unity with all women. And I don't think that's fair really to ask anyone, but that comes to dichotomy, of course. And then and we also have to remember that the 19th century racist rhetoric, even in the 20th century, was pervasive, not just against blacks, against immigrants. I mean, there were signs, Irish and dogs are not allowed, signs like that. And there was an anti-Asian sentiment, especially in the West Coast. I mean, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Native Americans didn't become citizens till 1924. So there's a nativist, racist sentiment throughout society, and the language. If sometimes we look at the language, today we would be appalled. There's also, however, a very strong sexist sentiment or anti-female sentiment that goes through all classes, through all races, through all layers of society. It doesn't matter if they are black, brown, white, Asian. There's pretty much always in sexist or male supremacy tone in the rhetoric. So I think that's part of the struggle, and that there's so many layers to it. And we always talk, well, black women versus white women. Well, white women are not a united group, and neither are black women. There are black women who are very educated, have a lot of money, have power and positions, even back then. And then there are women who don't. And the same with white women. There are white women who are, who might trace their way back to the Mayflower or something along the line, and others who just got off the boat, and we have to remember there's a huge immigration wave between 1880 and 1920. And a lot of the European arrivals had different ideas, had different experiences, different religion, predominantly Catholic and or Jewish. So I think we need to stop talking in easy labels and acknowledge that there was so much complexity. And at times there were really harsh words and there was a division, but there's also a lot of collaboration and different on all sides. There were different groups and different agendas. Some people thought the vote would just fix everything, but women don't vote in a block.
Right.
Not all women are progressives, right?
Right.
First of all, not all women gonna vote for certain issues, and blocking the women's vote was also politically motivated. Between the Democratic and Republican Party, and all black people don't vote the same. Just because you're black doesn't mean you're necessarily going to vote for a certain type of candidates. Black people are entitled to have various diverse political views, or tastes or interests, the same as anybody else. I mean, so I think that's kind of what's being overlooked. And I don't think it's fair to say which is my greatest oppression, because I think it changes day to day.
Interesting. So when we think about, equality versus equity,
Yeah.
and how that kind of plays into this conversation, what are some thoughts you can share on that?
Well, I mean, I think the Equal Rights Amendment has come up again that people really want to push to pass in the last couple of years. And it's, for those who don't know, the Equal Rights Amendment was first drafted in the early 1920s. After the suffrage amendment was passed, people felt like it wasn't enough to, because, people push, the suffrage amendment was passed, and then nothing changed. People kind of thought, oh, now everything is going to be great. No, it doesn't, in great part because prejudices are hard to overcome just because there's a law. And not all women think the same. And there was a big debate because the Equal Rights Amendment, a lot of people said the 14th Amendment already, guaranteed it. The question really between equality and equity is, if you put it in terms of the women's movement, do we want to be equal to men, or do we want to have equity and power? Because they're not the same. Because in more or less the last 100 years, it's always a struggle for equality, equality, equality. And many people say, well, we fought and fought and fought, and we are not that much further, although, obviously there have been some progress, because maybe there is an inherent flaw in this argument, because you can never be equal to a man because you're not the same. Because equality, if you think equality is sameness, do I really want everything that men have? Or is it the question that we want to have the same status and the same power or access to power, but still be uniquely feminine? And I know there's been people see it as a success that we have a woman trained in the special forces, or a woman general, or a woman heading the as a CEO of a big company, and all these firsts,
Mm-hmm.
But there are people who might question and say, okay, that's wonderful, but that's still just women trying to be as good as men. But it's still a male-defined, male-identified society. That's not really equality nor equity. Once you assign the same status to something that has always been seen traditional female, such as being a homemaker, for instance, right? Not that all women are homemakers, but let's say that's what you want to be. A homemaker should have the same status, prestige, respect, and finances, perhaps, as somebody who runs a company.
Right.
But we don't do that. And I don't see a lot of men struggling and striving to be, quote unquote, like women. I see women being told, you can be all you can be, like the old Army slogan, and be as good, lean in, be tough, negotiate, don't take no, but why?
Right.
The question is why. So and equity is really making sure that women, or any other group that doesn't have the same access, is seen and valued for what they contribute, acknowledging there might be differences, but valuing each equally. So that is a conversation that some people have, and because people argue that the equality struggle has not necessarily brought us as far as it could have.
Right. Well, it's a good it's a good debate to have, for sure, and to be able to explore both areas. So thank you for shedding some light on that. This has been a lot of good information to think of as we're winding down. Our time has passed quickly since there's been so much conversation. As we're winding down, though, I like to always end our conversations for our viewers with a little bit of maybe inspiration, or a little food for thought, if you will. When you think about where women were, and what they went through to get the right to vote, and then you think about where we are today, what are some thoughts and comments for women that you have about how to keep going in our movement, whether it's for equity, or equality, or wherever people feel like they stand and what they're looking for?
I think if we look at history, every time there was a success, whether it's in the women's movement or any other movement, it's when people work together and focused on the commonalities and not emphasize differences. I'm not saying we should ever brush it under the table. Differences have to be acknowledged. However, if we think about it more often, if we stop to listen, we see that there are more often more commonalities or common ground. Focus on that, because one group alone cannot win. And every success that we have accomplished, whether it was the civil rights movement, anything like that, there was always an alliance, multi stakeholder alliance. And because nobody can do it alone. So I think if we look, strength is in numbers, strength is in unity. And we also have to remember that some of our divisions are artificial and elites like to divide and conquer. That way, small groups stay in power. And that's been done since the Romans.
Right.
And it's been done, in the United States and every other country. So, don't listen to the propaganda. And I would
Strength
also
in
say,
numbers.
being an educator, find out the facts, read, and talk to each other.
Hmm.
Reach across. That's all I can say. Really, is the most productive.
So I know you wanted to do a shout out to one of your mentors.
Oh, I have so many mentors. I mean, my role model is obviously Anna Cooper, but I wanted to say hi to James Harris, retired dean from Montclair University. He is also the president of the New Jersey Black Educators Association. I'm a member of that too. My business partner and first vice president of NAACP Montclair. And we are very much active on behalf of the Amistad Commission in compliance. And then I also wanted to say hi to Dr. Lily Edwards from Drew University. She was instrumental in helping me with my book on Anna Cooper.
Well, shout out to them both. And I, as I shared, have a long time ago connection to James Harris myself.
Yeah,
My college days. I'm a big fan of he helped shape the activist in me as
yeah,
well. So shout out to him,
yes.
from me as well. Well, Christiane, thank you so much for sharing all the wealth of knowledge that is fit in your brain. It's amazing how it just flows so easily with dates and all. And so grateful that you were able to make the time, especially on this, wonderful day in women's history, to be able to share for us. For those of you watching, if there was someone in your life that you really wished had seen this conversation today, but was not watching, never fear. This lives on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel, and you can easily share the link, and whether it's individually or to one of your social media pages, so that others can watch it as well. And we encourage you to do that. Obviously, we encourage you to vote.
Yeah,
If you are not registered, please make sure that you take care of that. And make sure that you become familiar with the vote by mail process, and how to check once you have voted if it's been received. There's all the information will be sent to you, and how you can follow up on that. The reality of it is every election is an important election. I know that there's a lot of attention to this one because it's a presidential election, which is definitely important. But there are a lot of very important seats that are up right now, and all of the people we put in office really represent the policies that ultimately govern our lives. And so, you need to be thinking about your values and what's important to you when you are casting your vote, and making sure that you're putting someone in office that reflects what's important to you as a citizen and as a human being in this country. So please make sure that you get to know your candidates and make sure that they're aligned with you and your thinking as you're casting your vote. We also always encourage people to make sure you get your census done. We have a few more weeks for that. It's important to be counted and make sure that the resources get into your community. If we've seen anything over the last few months, we are very aware of the importance of resources, especially in tough times, but they're important at all times for sure. I also want to invite all of you to join the YWCA of Northern New Jersey on our 21-day Racial Equity and Social Justice Challenge. We will be kicking it off on September 9th. You can sign up today. It's a very interpersonal process. You will, for 21 business days, receive a link with some kind of a reading, a podcast, a documentary, something to educate you on racial justice and social justice issues, and encourage you to, look within and, challenge yourself, your implicit bias, your belief systems, and to learn more about race, power, privilege, and leadership. And as you know, Christiane said, our power is in numbers, and the more that we're all educated and learning and unlearning all the things that we need to do will bring us together to be able to make great change. So with that, you can sign up for the 21-day challenge. It's on our Facebook page, it's on our website, it's on our Instagram, in our Instagram account in the link, on our Twitter. And we encourage you, if you're part of an organization, to invite your organization members. If you're part of a business, to invite your coworkers, your family members, your faith-based institutions. It's really something for anyone. And again, as I said, it's a personal process. We also encourage you to join us for the rest of the week. Tomorrow we have Jasmine Moreno, the Director of Engagement for City Green and Urban Farm in Clifton. As you might remember, we've had a few conversations over the last few months about food and you know, how we get it and how it comes to us, and the importance of community farming in cities, and also its link, you know, to food and access to food and linked to racism. So, you know, it's an important discussion, and we encourage you to join us tomorrow for that discussion. On Thursday, we are continuing our Share the Mic Now program, and we hope you join us to hear another important voice in the Black community. As we know, we're sharing the mic with women to help amplify their stories, Black women to amplify their stories. And on Friday, we end the week with fun. Freeholder Tracy Zur, Bergen County Freeholder, will be sharing with us some fun and safe activities in Bergen County. We are getting ready to get closer to a holiday weekend as we're transitioning into September, and the County of Bergen has put together a wonderful activity book of programming and fun for families and for individuals. And so we'll talk through that a little bit with you. So lots to learn this week and inspire and engage you. We hope you have a fabulous day. Christiane, thank you so much again for sharing all of this wonderful information. And there's no better way to celebrate this day than exercising your right to vote.
Your right to vote, yes.
Exactly. So take care, everyone. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining the time with us. And thank you again, Christiane. Bye-bye.
Thank you.